Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be tackling something that's been debated for centuries, basically. How much control do we really have over our actions? It's a question that philosophers and scientists and lawyers have been wrestling with forever.
Oh, definitely a big one. Yeah.
And we're going to unpack it through two stories. They're so wild, they sound like they could be ripped from like a courtroom drama or something.
Yeah.
First, imagine, Angie Bachmann, she's a mom from Iowa, loses her entire inheritance gambling. And then she sues the casino,
Wow. Okay.
saying she couldn't stop, she couldn't help herself. Now, on the other side of the world, we have Brian Thomas. He tragically kills his wife while he was sleepwalking, and he ends up being acquitted of murder.
So two very different outcomes.
Right, totally different outcomes. But they both raise these questions about the power of habits. Like, are we truly responsible for everything we do, especially when those actions, become destructive or have terrible consequences?
Really makes you think, like, where's the line? When do we cross from, conscious choice to something else?
Exactly. So are we in control? Or are we kind of just at the mercy of our habits? To start untangling this whole mess, let's dive into Angie Bachmann's story first.
Okay.
So Angie, she's bored, a little lonely maybe, looking for something to like spice up her routine. I mean, can you relate to that at all?
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there, right? That feeling of needing a change or a break from the everyday.
Exactly. And so that's what leads her to the casino. It starts innocently enough, once a week, just for an hour. She's playing blackjack, kind of a fun little escape. And get this, she actually starts winning.
Oh, so that probably makes her feel even more in control.
Right, like she's got a system. But here's the thing, casinos are designed to keep you playing. They're not charities, they're businesses.
Yeah, they're masters at turning, casual gamblers into regulars.
And this was around the time, too, when Iowa had just legalized gambling. So Haraz Entertainment, that was the company that owned the casino, Angie was they were like on the cutting edge of using all this data to track customer habits.
I've heard about that. They were early adopters of all those algorithms that predict how much someone will spend. It's pretty wild.
It's kind of scary, actually. Like they had this thing called predicted lifetime value for each player.
Yeah, basically trying to figure out how much money they could squeeze out of every person who walked in the door.
Exactly. They were analyzing everything, like every bet, every win, every loss, trying to find the best way to, maximize their profits.
And not just passively tracking either. They were using that information to really target customers, lure them back in.
Right, like with those free limo rides, the concert tickets, the trips to Lake Tahoe. It all seems super generous on the surface, but...
But really, it's just a calculated strategy. They were associating their brand with these positive experiences to trigger that habit loop.
It's interesting. Angie was going through a lot at the time. Her parents were both, sick. She was traveling back and forth to Tennessee to help take care of them. I bet the casino felt like a refuge.
Oh, for sure. An escape from all that stress and worry. And, that's where those algorithms come in. Harris knew she was vulnerable, likely to gamble more when she was feeling down or stressed. They were exploiting her emotions.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to see it that way.
Right.
So she starts gambling more and more. The wins and losses, they get bigger. And eventually, she racks up $20,000 in debt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She ends up confessing to her husband, and they file for bankruptcy.
So she hits rock bottom. You'd think that's the end of the story, right?
Right. But there's a twist. Her parents pass away. And Angie inherits a good chunk of money, almost $1 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's like a chance for a fresh start, but, you can probably guess what happens.
Grief is a powerful emotion. Could definitely drive someone back to old habits.
Exactly. And that's what happens. Angie, she finds herself back at the casino. They even moved to Tennessee, where casinos are legal, to try to get away from the temptation. But one night, she's driving through her old hometown. The memories come flooding back,
Right, grief, stress, familiar places, they're all triggers.
And Haraz, they were waiting. They knew she was back in town. The offers start pouring in again. Free limo rides, trips to Mississippi, a fancy suite in Vegas.
Oh, wow. This time, they really pulled out all the stops.
Right. Like they offered her this suite at the Palazzo in Vegas, 6 bedrooms, private decks, hot tubs, a butler. It's like, how do you say no to that?
It's hard to resist, especially when you're feeling vulnerable. But it's important to remember it's all part of a larger strategy.
Totally. They were playing the long game. They knew even a short visit could reignite that habit loop.
And did it work?
Oh, yeah. Angie was back at the blackjack table. The losses started piling up. And then, get this, there's one night where she loses $250,000.
Oh my gosh. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, like, how much control did she really have?
Right. It blurs the lines between personal responsibility and, the power of addiction.
And to understand that better, we have to look at the science. We need to talk about Reza Habib. He's a neuroscientist who studies pathological gamblers. His work is really fascinating.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of him. Didn't he do some research using those brain imaging machines, the MRI thing?
Exactly. He had people lie in an MRI machine while they watched a simulated slot machine. And what he found was that even though they weren't playing for real money, the areas of their brains associated with emotion and reward were going crazy, especially in the pathological gamblers.
So their brains were reacting as if they were winning, even though they weren't.
Exactly. And it gets weirder. Habib also found that pathological gamblers, they respond to near misses as if they were actual wins. Like imagine your brain's getting that thrill of victory even when you technically lost.
So it's like their brains are wired to crave those near misses.
It's almost like a cruel trick, right?
It is. And that might be why it's so hard for some people to stop gambling. Those near misses, they just trigger the same habit loop as wins, creating this powerful pull to keep playing.
And you know it's messed up? Casinos know this. They reprogram their machines to deliver more near misses.
It's like they're pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. So if our brains are wired to respond to these cues and rewards in such predictable ways, how much control do we really have?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it becomes even more complex when we turn our attention to Brian Thomas and his story.
We just explored how habits can lead to, like, financial ruin, right?
Well,
But can they also lead to something even more serious, something unthinkable? And that's where Brian Thomas's story comes in.
it's a chilling case, a real nightmare.
Yeah, totally. So let's rewind back to July 2008. Brian and his wife, Christine, they're on vacation in Wales. It's supposed to be this relaxing getaway. And then Brian makes this frantic 911 call. He's absolutely convinced he's just killed an intruder, someone who was attacking Christine. But when the police get there,
They find out the intruder was actually Christine.
it was a tragic case of mistaken identity during a sleepwalking episode. And the thing is, this wasn't just a one-time thing for Brian. He had a long history of sleepwalking, went all the way back to childhood.
So this wasn't just a random, isolated event.
Right. Like I've heard stories about people sleepwalking, but usually it's pretty harmless, right? Like wandering around the house, maybe raiding the fridge. But Brian's case, it's just so much more complex, even dangerous. He'd walked in the yard, even swam in a canal while he was sleepwalking.
It seems unbelievable, but those are actually pretty common examples of how sleepwalking can manifest. It all boils down to how our brains function, or malfunction, I guess you could say, during sleep.
Okay, so help me understand this. Why doesn't our brain, like our survival instinct or whatever, kick in and prevent us from doing dangerous things while we're asleep?
Well, here's the thing. Normally, when we sleep, our brainstem, that's like the most primitive part of our brain, it basically paralyzes our limbs. It's kind of like a safety switch to
Right.
stop us from acting out our dreams.
Okay, that makes sense. But in Brian's case, and I guess in other sleepwalkers, this safety switch is faulty.
Exactly. There's this incomplete paralysis. So the parts of the brain that control movement, they can still be active, but the higher level functions like decision-making and self-awareness, those are offline.
So it's like your body's running on autopilot,
hmm
but the part of your brain that usually makes the decisions, it's asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. You can literally walk, talk, even perform complex actions, all while being completely unconscious.
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it.
Yeah.
So in Brian's case, this wasn't just a random sleepwalking episode. This was a pattern of behavior that had been repeating itself for years.
And this tragic act, was it basically like the culmination of all those years of ingrained sleepwalking habits, just with a horrific outcome this time?
That's a huge question. And it brings us to this legal concept called automatism.
Okay, yeah.
Break that down for me. I'm not a lawyer.
Basically, it's the argument that you committed a crime, but you did it without conscious intent. You're physically acting, but you weren't consciously controlling your actions.
So your body's moving, but your mind's not really there.
Exactly. And it's been used successfully as a defense in court before.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There are actually several cases where people were acquitted of crimes because they were sleepwalking. There's Kenneth Parks. He drove to his in-laws' house and killed his father-in-law while he was sleepwalking. He was found not guilty. Then there's Jules Lowe. He killed his father during a sleepwalking episode, also acquitted. And Donna Shepherd Saunders, she tried to suffocate her mother while sleepwalking. The courts found her not guilty, too.
So there's a precedent for this, acknowledging that sometimes even actions with really serious consequences can happen without conscious control.
Right.
Okay, so how did this apply to Brian Thomas's case?
Well, to get to the bottom of it, to really understand the science behind his sleepwalking, the prosecution brought in a sleep expert, Dr. Chris Idzikowski. He ran a whole sleep study on Brian, monitored his brainwaves, muscle activity, all sorts of physiological data while he was asleep.
So they were trying to figure out scientifically if he was actually asleep when he killed his wife.
Exactly. And the results were pretty clear. Brian was asleep during the incident, no doubt about it.
Wow. So they had the scientific evidence to back up the automatism defense?
They did. But even with that evidence, the prosecution, they initially pushed for a conviction. They argued that Brian's history of sleepwalking, it should have made him more aware of the risks, that he should have taken precautions.
So even though he wasn't conscious during the act itself, they were saying he should still be held responsible because he knew he was prone to sleepwalking.
Right. It's a tough argument. But as the trial went on, even the prosecution's own expert witnesses, they started to have doubts. They admitted that, yeah, Brian knew he sleepwalked, but there was no reason for him to think he'd ever become violent. He'd never hurt anyone before. There was no history of aggression or anything like that in his relationship with his wife.
So just because you know you have a condition, it doesn't mean you know how it might manifest in extreme situations.
Right, and that was a turning point in the trial. The prosecution ended up dropping the charges. They acknowledged that Brian wasn't in control of his actions that night. The judge even said that Brian was a decent man and a devoted husband who was not responsible for his wife's death.
Wow. That's a pretty remarkable outcome.
It is.
So we have Angie, who loses her fortune gambling, and she's held accountable. And then we have Brian, who kills his wife while he's sleepwalking, and he's set free.
Oh,
Why such different outcomes?
it's a tough question. Is it because society tends to view gambling as a choice, a vice, while sleepwalking is seen as a medical condition, something outside of your control?
It's almost like we're more willing to forgive someone for an act they committed unconsciously, even if the consequences are more severe. But is that fair? Is that really justice?
That's what we're trying to figure out here. These cases challenge our whole understanding of responsibility and free will.
Right. So we've seen how habits can lead to financial ruin and even violence. But what about the bigger picture? What can we learn from all of this about the nature of habits? What role do they play in shaping who we are?
And that's where we need to bring in some of the big thinkers. People like William James, he called habits the enormous flywheel of society.
A flywheel. Okay, I'm listening. Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff. Two really complex cases where ingrained habits led to, some really intense consequences. Financial ruin on one hand, a tragic loss of life on the other. It makes you think, are we really in control?
Right, and that's where the work of William James becomes so important. He was this groundbreaking psychologist and philosopher, and he had some fascinating things to say about habits. He actually called them the enormous flywheel of society.
A flywheel. Okay, I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, think of it this way. A flywheel is this big, heavy disc. It spins and helps regulate the speed of a machine, keeps everything running smoothly.
Okay, I can picture that. But how does that relate to our habits?
James believed that habits play a similar role in our lives,
Yeah.
in society as a whole even. They provide stability, consistency. They allow us to function without having to constantly make conscious decisions about every little thing.
So habits are like the autopilot of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. They free up our mental energy for other things, more important stuff. But James also knew that habits had a dark side. Like, they can trap us in negative patterns or prevent us from growing and changing.
It's like that saying, right? Habits are our best friends and our worst enemies.
Exactly. And James had this really vivid analogy for how habits form. He compared it to water carving a channel in the ground. Each time the water flows, the channel gets deeper, and it becomes easier and easier for the water to follow that same path.
So our habits become like these ingrained pathways in our brains. And they guide our behavior without us even realizing it.
You got it. But here's the really cool part. James also believed in the power of conscious choice. He thought we could actively shape our habits instead of being ruled by them.
So we're not just like pre-programmed robots destined to repeat the same patterns forever.
Not at all. James believed that with effort and awareness, we can actually modify those channels in our brains, create new pathways, even redirect the flow of our habits.
I actually remember reading about how James himself struggled with his own habits, right? Wasn't there something about a year-long experiment he did?
Yeah, you're right. He did this whole experiment where he spent a year intentionally believing in free will. He wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't just a slave to his habits, that he had the power to change.
It's pretty inspiring that even someone as brilliant as William James had to work at it, It makes it
Mhm.
feel more attainable for the rest of us.
Definitely. And it all starts with being aware. Once you recognize the habits that are shaping your life, you can start to make conscious choices about which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to change.
It's not about beating ourselves up for our bad habits then, but about understanding them, seeing them for what they are.
Exactly. And that awareness is what gives us the power to make different choices.
This reminds me of that David Foster Wallace speech, the one about the fish who don't even realize they're swimming in water.
Oh, yeah, this is water.
Ooh.
Such a powerful speech. It's a great metaphor for how our habits become the invisible forces that shape our reality. We're often just going through life on autopilot, totally unaware of the patterns that are driving our thoughts and actions.
And until we become aware, we can't really change them.
Exactly. Awareness is like the first step to unlocking our potential for change.
So bringing it all back to Angie and Brian, the two cases we discussed, it makes you wonder, how do we balance personal accountability with this understanding that habits can have such a huge impact on our lives, even lead to really tragic consequences sometimes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Maybe the key is realizing that habits aren't destiny. They're choices. Even when they feel automatic, they're still based on decisions that we've made along the way.
So it's about recognizing those choices, even the ones we made without realizing it.
Right. And once we see them, we can start making different choices. Choices that line up with the kind of life we really want to live.
This has been a truly mind-blowing conversation. I'm definitely going to be looking at my own habits a little differently now.
Me too. It's been a real pleasure diving into all of this with you.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. And to everyone listening, I hope this is giving you some food for thought. Think about your own habits, the good ones, the bad ones, the ones that are serving you, and the ones that might be holding you back. The important thing to remember is you have the power to choose.